Hello and welcome. My name is Cheyenne McGowan. I'm a public ally with Community Legal Aid Society, where I work within the housing unit. And for Fair Housing Month, I'm hosting a series on the unasked questions around fair housing. Each week, I will be sitting with a new guest to help answer some unasked questions. Today, I'm here with Director Matt Heckles from the Delaware State Housing Authority. Please tell us a little bit about your background, your job, and why do you think the history of fair housing is important?
Well, thank you first of all for doing this. I think it's fantastic that you and CLASI are finding new ways to talk about such an important topic. So again, my name is Matt Heckles. I'm the director of the Delaware State Housing Authority. I've been in this job just a few weeks. I'm appointed by Governor Meyer at the end of January. Before that, I spent some time in the Biden administration as the regional administrator for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Before that, I ran housing programs for the state of Maryland. And before that, I spent 12 years here at DSHA. It feels like such a long time ago. I keep saying I was here when I was a kid. But I started off doing legislative work and then moved into some policy work. I've run some programs, but really working in affordable housing and community development programs is where I've spent my career so far. It's just been something I wasn't necessarily planning on. I don't know many people who grew up thinking, well, I want to really specialize in affordable housing finance, but more people should, because it is really important work that forms our communities. And I think as we talk about this over the next few minutes here, it's really important that we think differently about how we go about this work. So your second part of your question was really about our history. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about the job that I'm in today is that Governor Meyer starts almost every conversation around housing with a statement about how housing is a human right in his mind. That's not reflected in our national constitution. It's not even reflected necessarily in our state constitution. So it is sort of left to a belief system for us. But that's where we start. And especially here around fair housing and Fair Housing Month, it's important for us to make sure that is the starting point, that is the core belief that we have. We certainly don't always achieve the outcome, but that's where we start. Our country has a long history, and no matter how some people may want to bury that history, to not talk about it, or to not look at the data that shows the results of our history. Housing, is such an important part of people's lives. It is how we segment ourselves in society a lot of the time. It determines access to good schools. It determines access to transportation, to good jobs, to a range of opportunities. There are a lot of studies that even show that where you live can sometimes determine how long you will live, which is really amazing when you think about it. And again, when this is not by mistake, and no matter how hard some people may try to ignore our past, it's really important for us to recognize that, because how do you fix what you don't know? So we have to keep looking at information, understanding how we got here so that we can go back and make sure that we are changing what we do today so that our future looks better. When we look at the housing needs assessment for the state of Delaware, for example, and housing affordability, we see that we're about 20,000 units of affordable housing short. And that's a supply issue that is caused by our history, by our zoning practices, by our permitting practices, by things like parking requirements, things like lot sizes and square footage sizes. The average home these days, don't quote me on the number because I can't remember exactly where I read it, but I think it's a new home is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 square feet. That by its nature, that home is going to be expensive. It's going to be priced in the $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 range because of its size. And so even things like that we may think are good rules and regulations and zoning laws that we have in place are exclusionary. And usually that's what they're trying to accomplish, is make sure that only a certain type of development is allowed in a jurisdiction. And what we've learned, I think, is that over the past few decades, we have been building housing, especially here in Delaware, and that's a good thing. But we haven't always built the right kind of housing. And so we are faced with a situation, again, as Governor Meyer, I think, outlined very clearly in his campaign and is a cornerstone of his administration, is that housing prices are a big part of how prices and costs have gone up for families all across Delaware. Housing is a big part of that cost increase, and it's making life really difficult because our incomes aren't keeping up, especially with housing costs. We can talk about eggs some other time, but housing costs are such a big part of the family budget. And so we have to work to make sure that we have other housing options available for people beyond that big house on a lot of land. People's desires have changed too. We saw that a lot during the pandemic. People don't necessarily want to mow the lawn every Saturday afternoon through the summer. They want more dense living. They want to be living in a place where they have a sense of community, access to food and shopping and all of these other amenities of a community, and affordable housing to go along with that. And fair housing is a critical component of that, because only through the lens of fair housing can we see how our past has not given us the results that we need to see, that we understand and that we want to see today.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciated your response. I think your background adds a lot to a lot of the things that you've said and the things that you've been able to accomplish in your career. So this episode is focused on the history of fair housing within Delaware. As director of the State Housing Authority, you oversee policies that ensure fair and equitable housing. Delaware has a history of involvement in the fair housing movement, from civil rights activism to laying some groundwork for the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Where are the connections between that history and how it's shaped the state's current housing policies? And what role does the Housing Authority play in continuing that legacy today?
Yeah, I've been talking a lot about how I think, our first job here at DSHA, and my first job is as the director of DSHA, means that we have to be running good programs. And there's a lot that DSHA does. We are the Public Housing Authority for Kent and Sussex counties. That means that we offer rental vouchers, rental subsidies, and public housing. We own and operate public housing in the same way that what they do at the Wilmington Housing Authority, Newcastle County, Dover, and the city of Newark as well. So there are 5 public housing authorities that do that across the state of Delaware. We're also the entity that allocates a lot of federal and state resources for the development of new affordable rental housing program. And we have community development programs like the Downtown Development District program. And then we also use tax-exempt bond financing to give advantages to first-time home buyers, income-qualified first-time home buyers with down payment assistance and lower interest rates. And in all of that, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're giving advantages and we're enabling the market to serve more people than it normally would. Most of what DSHA does is public-private partnerships. We don't develop the rental housing. We help to finance it in exchange for affordability. We don't necessarily issue the mortgages to the first-time home buyer. We provide the financing to the lender to provide that. So everything that we do is really partnership-based and this public-private partnership concept. But with that lens of trying to make sure that our history informs our decisions moving forward. The home ownership rate is something that I think we pride ourselves actually in Delaware on our home ownership rate overall. We have one of the highest home ownership rates in the country. And that's a great thing. Home ownership is great for families, for stability, for communities, for the passing of wealth from one generation to the next. Even in Delaware, our homeownership gap between white households and African-American and Black and Hispanic households is 30%. There's no good reason for that, that I can think of at least. And what's crazy about that number is that it's larger today than it was 20 years ago. We think we're making a lot of progress. We think we're doing really good things, but the evidence, at least on that line, is that we still have a lot of work to do. I mentioned I worked for the Biden administration. Secretary Fudge was the secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development while I was there. And she used to say, listen, America's a great place. We all have freedom. We have access to a lot of things. We all, have this this ability to run and to compete and to run this race of life. She said the problem is that some of us are starting, a mile before the starting line, right? And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Yes, you may have every opportunity before you on paper, but if you start your life in a place where you don't have access to good schools because of where you live, you don't have access to fresh food because of where you live, you don't have access to healthcare because of where you live, then it's really hard for people then to take advantage of all of the things that they can take advantage of on paper in this country. And so this is about fairness, but it's also it's about recognizing our history and making sure that we overcome that history and provide those opportunities in a fair way.
Thank you so much again. Delaware, like many states, has experienced significant demographic shifts over a number of decades, particularly with suburban migration, reshaping cities and urban communities. What is your vision for DSHA, and how can Delaware promote more equitable revitalization? And are there any initiatives that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah. Oh, there's, for all of the challenges that we have and perhaps all of the ways that we wish we had come farther in this work by now, there is some really great work that's been done. One of the things that we're really stressed with lately is a lack of supply, not only of affordable housing, which has kind of been there for a long time, but just supply of housing, period. Across the country, the best studies I've seen is that, we need somewhere between 4 million and 7 million units of housing. And part of that is just because, since the financial crisis, it's been really difficult market to build. There was an oversupply, not for good reasons, but when people were losing their homes during the financial crisis to foreclosure, there was all the, sort of the price of housing came down because there was all of this available housing. And since then, the market has not built enough, and even before that. And as I said before, even what we are building is not necessarily meeting the needs of every American, every Delawarean, because of the way that we restrict zoning and permitting, and tend to get larger, more spread out housing. And so one of the things that started before I came back to work here in Delaware was the creation of an affordable housing production task force. And actually just this morning, we finalized those recommendations, and I think gives us a roadmap on how we can move some of this stuff forward. And supply is a really big deal, because the way I think about it is there's this downward pressure on the housing market because there's a lack of supply. And what gets the people that are feeling this lack of supply the most are the people at the bottom. They're the ones that get squeezed out of the market with all of this pressure pushing down on the market. And so the best way for us to move forward is to relieve that pressure by increasing supply. And so this task force will give us a roadmap forward on how we can do that here in Delaware, with zoning changes, with investments from the state to address affordable housing needs, with speeding up our permitting process so that we can make Delaware a place where the market wants to come in and invest. My primary job is to make sure that people have affordable housing, but if the market isn't functioning in the way that it's supposed to, it makes my job that much harder because of that downward pressure. Executive Order number 4 was one of the first things that Governor Meyer did while in office, and that is requiring the state agencies to that have a role in the development process to speed up and make their permitting process easier for developers, so that we are creating an environment here in Delaware where people will invest in real estate going forward and help us to close that supply gap. The state is certainly not going to build 50,000 units of housing. So that will almost entirely be done by the market. So we have to create an environment where the market wants to do that. But it goes from that to the whole way through to, how can DSHA, how can the state, how can this administration, focus on some of the granular pieces too. We are in year 10 of administering the Downtown Development Program, a program that I worked on in when I was here as a kid, and created by the Markell administration to invest in downtown areas. We have, funded nearly $40 million in state funds. That has leveraged nearly $600 million in private investment because of the way that the program is set up. In downtowns in Dover and Seaford and Wilmington and Georgetown and Harrington and Laurel and Milford and Smyrna and Clayton and Delaware City, Newcastle and Middletown. I mean, these are the core downtown areas of the state, and investing in them is really important. We've gotten when you think about housing policy and restrictive zoning, what all that does is move people out. It's harder and harder to build and rebuild. So it incentivizes the creation of suburban development. But that causes problems environmentally. It causes problems with traffic. It causes all kinds of add-on problems. We need to get back to our downtown areas and make sure that we're reinvesting in them. There's a right and a wrong way to do this, but there are a couple of key components that I think are really important guiding principles. One is, you want to create new housing in areas of opportunity, especially new affordable housing in areas of opportunity. Again, because the school that you go to is so closely tied to where you live, we need to create affordable housing near good schools, near good jobs, near transportation, all of those things. But we also have to lift up areas that have been underinvested in, that are in distress, and that takes the entirety of state government, not just a housing perspective, but for all of these agencies at the state level, the federal level, the local level, and our partners in the nonprofit sector and others, to make sure that we're bringing all of this together and creating the right environment for people to live in, and towns and cities are a great place to do that. But some of the work that we're doing on fair housing specifically is around the Delaware Fair Housing Coalition. This is an evolution, but includes people like Ramona Fulman at the Division of Human and Civil Rights, and Rashmi from CLASI, of course, and a couple of folks here at DSHA, Karen Horn and Caitlin Del Colo, who are they're focused on this more than maybe anyone else. And I think there was a little lull in some of the meetings and some of the conversation around fair housing, but we're picking that back up now because we're seeing a lack of leadership at the federal level, being generous perhaps with calling a lack of leadership, that requires us to sort of pick up the slack and invest and focus on this even more at the state level.
Well, it sounds like you're definitely building off of your own personal legacy throughout your time and service to Delaware and around the country. And I'm really happy to hear that you will be, helping to build up the city and other smaller towns throughout Delaware that may seem to be forgotten. And speaking of legacy, again, as the director of state of the Delaware State Housing Authority, your role is directly connected to the legacy of the Fair Housing Act. Looking at some of your work, DSHA has published before, including the 2020 statewide analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, which was a body of work that focused on progressing the fair housing here in Delaware. Can you share some of the ways in which this text, initiatives like Fair Housing Month, and the Act continue to benefit the lives of Delawareans today?
Yeah. Again, I in all of the work that we do, we have to understand the problems. If we aren't going into the creation of new programs with an open eye, towards our history and the current landscape, we're going to make big mistakes. And we'll probably make mistakes anyway, but we'll make them smaller by understanding housing policies are really hard to get right. But again, feeding all of the information that we can into that process, whether it is looking back, looking at our communities, looking at the needs, looking at the data, the disparities that we talked about in homeownership, for example, understanding that is a way for us to make sure that we are creating programs that can adjust, our future going forward. It's fair housing. I always think of fair housing as the threshold, the bar. It requires that we not discriminate based on the protected classes. And I always kind of feel like that means that that's the least we can do. Okay? But that only means that we're not causing more problems going forward from a discrimination standpoint. It doesn't have anything in the fair housing law that helps us to recognize, again, that history that we know has contributed to the way our housing and opportunities are allocated across our society. And that's where the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing comes in. Really hard to say, and I wish that there was a better way, better words, because it's a tongue twister. But what it essentially means is that we have to do better than just meeting the minimum standards of the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 and amended since then. It means that we have to go beyond that and make sure that the things that we're doing today are also correcting and not perpetuating all of the things that happened before 1968 and, quite frankly, since then, that maybe weren't discriminatory, but weren't helping to cure the results of our discriminatory past. And, you know, so all of that to say that we have to continue to study the issue. We have to continue to make sure that we understand the data, the information. We have to keep talking about it. The current administration in Washington just repealed, I think would be the right word, the requirement for local jurisdictions to do the study that you just mentioned, to look at the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And will accept locality self-certification that it is affirmatively furthering fair housing. That certainly is not the standard that I think we ought to hold ourselves to. So things are moving very quickly, but we will find a way to make sure that we keep the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing, that we keep you know, a light shining on this issue, and find a way to make sure that Delaware continues the work of not only protecting people through the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, but also making sure that we are moving forward and correcting our history, or the results of our history as well.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm sure, and I can maybe speak for most Delawareans, but I would say that we're very grateful to have you as our director of our state housing authority. And thank you again for helping me to answer some unasked questions. For everyone watching, please join us next week and the rest of this month as we continue to discuss discrimination, what that may look like, who's doing the work, and how to spot it. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.